Good evening, and thank you for joining the New York Jewish Week and UJA Federation of New York for our monthly Folio literary series. I'm Thea Wieseltier, Director of Public Programs at 70 Faces Media, parent company of the New York Jewish Week. Before we dive into tonight's program, I just want to take a moment to celebrate how much our literary family has expanded. We've seen an incredible surge in attendance lately, and your energy is what keeps this event thriving month after month. Let's keep that momentum going tonight as we welcome award-winning journalist and author Yardena Schwartz, who will discuss her acclaimed book, Ghosts of a Holy War, with Andrew Silo Carroll, editor-at-large at New York Jewish Week. This book traces the enduring legacy of the 1929 Hebron Massacre and the ways its echoes can still be felt nearly a century later. With meticulous skill, Yardena draws on historical research, contemporary reporting, and the letters of a young American student killed in the attack to bring this pivotal history vividly to life, and raises questions that remain relevant today. UJA's work in Israel began long before the establishment of Israel in 1948 and remains central to its mission today, helping Israelis in crisis every day by supporting the physical, emotional, and economic healing needed to carry Israel forward and strengthening the bond between Israel and the diaspora. And now, I'm pleased to turn things over to Yardena and Andy to start our program. Enjoy.
Thank you, Thea, and good evening, everyone, and welcome. Tonight, we are joined by Yardena Schwartz, an award-winning journalist and Emmy-nominated producer whose reporting has taken her across 4 continents and she's appeared in publications including New York Times, Wall Street Journal, New York Review of Books. The list goes on. Yardena spent a decade based in Israel, reporting for NBC News and MSNBC. And her first book, which is what we're going to talk about tonight, Ghosts of a Holy War, the 1929 massacre in Palestine that ignited the Arab-Israeli conflict, was published in October 2024. The good news is it's coming out in paperback in October. You can pre-order. And it is being developed into a feature film, which we may get to a little bit later. The book takes on a largely forgotten episode, the massacre of 67 Jews in Hebron in August 1929, and it asks what that moment can tell us about the century of conflict that followed. We're going to talk about all that tonight, but before we begin, I want to thank tonight's sponsors, again, UJA Federation of New York and the New York Jewish Week for making the conversation possible. And if you do have questions for me or for Yardena, please put them in the Q&A, not the chat, the Q&A. So Yardena, thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me here. It's great to see you again, Andy. You mentioned some of the publications I wrote for, but I also wrote for you back when you were at JTA. It's been a pleasure to work with you throughout the years, and I'm happy to be here tonight.
Thank you. Appreciate it. So I want to start to set the scene. Before we get to Hebron, before we get to what happened in 1929, what's happening in Mandatory Palestine in the years leading up to this massacre?
So in the decade prior to the massacre of 1929, the population of Palestine, of British Mandate Palestine, had grown tremendously, not just with the influx of Jewish refugees and Jews fleeing, Eastern European countries where they were being either slaughtered in pogroms or simply shut out of professions, out of cities where they could not live, and they had been going to the US, but increasingly the US was also not a place where they were welcome. And Palestine, after it had been conquered by the British, conquered from the Ottoman Empire, the Ottomans had ruled Palestine for centuries. They too had had strict quotas on Jewish immigration to the land of Israel, to what was then known as Palestine. Mm-hmm. And when the British conquered Palestine from the Ottoman Empire, not only did they introduce the British Mandate, the Balfour Declaration, with the promise of a Jewish home, but they had ended centuries of restriction on Jewish life and restrictions on Jewish immigration. So immigration of Jews from Eastern Europe had, I think, doubled in the years prior to 1929. But another element that we saw in the lead up to this massacre was the increase of religious incitement among Muslim leaders, particularly the leader of Palestinian Muslims under British rule, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who was essentially the Muslim equivalent of Chief Rabbi of Palestine. He was the most important Islamic official in the land. He had been plagued by accusations of corruption, nepotism, misuse of funds. He didn't really hold the qualifications for the position he held. He had never completed his religious studies. It was essentially like appointing a man who never finished rabbinical school to be the chief rabbi of Palestine. So he had been very unpopular. And around 1928, he realized the power of the world's oldest scapegoat, which is to blame everyone's problems on the Jews. And so what he did was he convinced the Muslims of Palestine that the Jews in Palestine, the Jewish minority in Palestine, those who had been there for generations, along with those who were now arriving from Europe, they were coming not to live in peace, but to conquer Al-Aqsa, the mosque that was built atop the ruins of the ancient Jewish temples in Jerusalem, what we know as the Temple Mount. So this lie that the Jews of Palestine were planning to conquer, destroy Al-Aqsa, and rebuild their ancient temple took hold over the course of the year prior to the massacre. And because the Grand Mufti was not only in charge of the Islamic holy sites in Jerusalem, but also all of the Sharia courts, all of the appointments of Muslim teachers, Muslim clerics throughout Palestine, he appointed the Islamic officials in places like Hebron and Sfat. And he convinced people, Muslims throughout Palestine, that Jews, wherever they were a threat to Islam. So not only in Jerusalem, but in Hebron, the second holiest city in Judaism, burial place of Abraham and the rest of the patriarchs and matriarchs of the Jewish people. Hebron had been one of the holiest sites in Judaism because of that, the fact that the patriarchs and matriarchs were buried there. Yet in 1929 and for 700 years under Muslim rule, Jews were forbidden from entering the tomb of the patriarchs and matriarchs because it had become a mosque. And the incitement and the disinformation campaign surrounding Al-Aqsa also extended to the tomb of the patriarchs and matriarchs. So Hebron's Islamic officials convinced Arabs in Hebron that the Jews in Hebron were planning to turn the tomb of the patriarchs and matriarchs into a synagogue and to destroy the mosque. So this incitement and this disinformation was just really everywhere throughout the land at that time.
Does that represent kind of the only Palestinian reaction to what's happening? Are there other secular or political parties, or I don't mean parties in the formal sense, I mean, constituents who are A, looking for some accommodation with the growing Jewish population, or B, they have legitimate concerns about it and they're expressing it perhaps in a nonviolent way? I'm just curious, what are the other strains going on at the time?
Yeah, it's a great question. Actually, the Grand Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini had been appointed by the British, interestingly enough. He had already been accused of inciting a previous riot in 1920, and he had fled. But the British, soon after the British Mandate began, they appointed him to be the Grand Mufti, thinking that this would help appease Arab constituents in Palestine who were suspicious of British rule, being that this was after 1,000 years of Muslim rule in Palestine, and suddenly you have the British come in, and the High Commissioner, the British High Commissioner, the first British High Commissioner of Palestine, was not only Jewish, but he was a Zionist. And his arrival in Palestine had been celebrated by the Jewish residents, and the British apparently thought that if they went with the candidate for Grand Mufti who was the most anti-Zionist, that this would help appease Arab voters. And what happened was that the other candidates who were far more qualified for the position of Grand Mufti They had been much more cooperative with the Jewish population. They had been in favor of coexistence and of a shared future. They had the Grand Mufti's own half brother, who had been Mufti before him, had deferred from their father. Their father had also been Grand Mufti, and he was virulently anti-Semitic, opposed Jewish immigration to even in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem at the time was a majority Jewish city. It had been already for a century at that point. And yet his son, Haj Amini's half brother, had been very friendly with Zionist leaders, including Chaim Weizmann. And that was the case for the other candidates who were vying for the position of Grand Mufti, the ones that the British overlooked. They had been in favor of the Zionist movement. They saw that it was bringing, a better economic conditions to the people of Palestine, including the Arabs of Palestine. They saw that they were creating new industries, improving existing industries, improving infrastructure and education in Palestine. And yet, once the Grand Mufti came to power, and particularly after he began this disinformation campaign, he convinced Muslims in Palestine that these other leaders, for example, mayors of other cities like Jaffa and Haifa, who at times were very friendly with Zionist leaders and were in favor of Zionism, he convinced them that these people were traitors. They were collaborators with the Jews in this plan to conquer Al-Aqsa. And so increasingly, these leaders who might have become, really promising partners in the establishment of some kind of eventual two-state solution or some kind of, cooperative existence, peaceful coexistence, these leaders were increasingly either intimidated, harassed, or even assassinated. Later on, when the Grand Mufti oversaw a violent rebellion against Zionism and against the British from 1936 to 1939, about 1,000 Arab leaders were killed by the henchmen of the Grand Mufti, who were out to defeat anyone who disagreed with his hardline stance and his extremism, and anyone who was in favor of cooperating with the Zionist movement.
So let's talk about the Zionist movement for a second. What at this point, what are their aspirations? Maybe they're most realistic or they're most idealistic. Are we talking about everything from, like you said, a two-state solution, a one-state solution, a greater Israel that includes, what we now think of as the West Bank? What are they, just besides reclaiming the land, settling kibbutzim, settling the big cities? What are they expressing as their hopes and dreams?
So it really deferred depending on which Zionists you were asking.
Sure.
So, the mainstream Zionists like David Ben Gurion, Chaim Weizmann, and others like them, they, at least in the 1920s, were really just talking about a Jewish home in the same language that the British were using. They weren't really talking about a Jewish state. They weren't talking about, having a Jewish majority and an Arab minority living in that state. It was really just, the focus was creating a place where Jews could be safe from the anti-Semitism that was making their lives insufferable in Europe, creating a place where the doors would always be open to them, unlike the US. And they were really trying to establish a kind of environment where that would be possible to do with the Arab leadership and with the Arab population. They were not trying, at least not publicly, they were not trying to sideline Arab rights. I mean, written into the British mandate, and the Zionist leaders, mainstream Zionist leaders at the time, echoed this language. Written into the British mandate was the fact that with the creation of a Jewish home, not a Jewish state, the right of Arabs and non-Jews in Palestine would be protected. So the goal was never to kind of create a separate system of laws or a separate, kind of, hierarchy of Jews versus Arabs. And that was actually a reversal of what had existed prior to the British mandate. Under Ottoman rule and under, a millennium of Muslim rule, There was a hierarchy. There were first-class citizens and second-class citizens. The first-class citizens were the Muslims, and the second-class citizens were the non-Muslims. Jews, Christians, they paid special taxes. They were restricted from entering their holy sites. In Jerusalem, Jews could not access the Temple Mount at all. The closest place they could pray, the only place they could pray in the vicinity of the Temple Mount was the Western Wall. And what
Mhm.
we know today as the Western Wall was not what the Western Wall was in
Right.
1929. It was this tiny little alleyway, and it was directly adjacent to an Arab neighborhood. And the Arabs who lived in this neighborhood would often throw their trash next to the kotel, spit at Jewish worshipers at the kotel, curse at them. So the the really the cause of the Zionist movement at that time was really to just create a place where Jews wouldn't have to live like that, wouldn't have to live as second-class citizens, the only place in the world really where they could. And it was the revisionist Zionists, so not the actual leaders of the Zionist movement, but more kind of fringe leaders, if you will. The
Opposition, really, maybe.
opposition, right? So Jabotinsky and his followers believed in a greater Israel, would settle for nothing less than a majority Jewish state with an Arab minority. And in testimony that Jabotinsky later made to the British in the wake of not only the massacre in 1929, but also the attacks on Jews that characterized the Great Arab Revolt from 1936 to 1939, when the British this was when the British first introduced the first proposal for a two-state solution. This was 1937. When Jabotinsky was asked to testify, along with Ben Gurion and Chaim Weizmann. So Jabotinsky he said a lot of the same things that Chaim Weizmann did. Chaim Weizmann talked about how, we're open to the idea of a binational state, a two-state solution, as long as we, have a place where Jews can live freely. Jabotinsky said, no, I mean, we need a majority Jewish state, but he said that the idea that that the Arabs of Palestine becoming a minority should not be cause for war. It shouldn't be cause for these killing sprees. He argued that, the Arabs have more than a dozen states, and he predicted that they would have many more than that in the future, and that this was just one tiny little sliver of land, the only place where Jews would be or could be a majority, and that shouldn't really be such a cause for concern for so many. And he and the other, revisionist Zionists were opposed to the idea of a binational state, which until then had actually been not such a controversial concept within the Zionist movement. There was a Zionist party and several Zionist parties that advocated for binational governments. And again, this is only in 1937. Until then, there had not really been talk of partitioning the land. The thought was, okay, this is going to be a British territory, but at least they thought we can have a government that's, representing the people of Palestine, whether they're Jewish or Arabs. Because again,
Right.
it was called Palestine, and whether you were Jewish or Arab, you were Palestinian. And it was the Jewish leaders and the Zionist leaders who accepted the notion of sharing governance and creating a binational government. The Arab leadership was vehemently against it, but that was because the Grand Mufti had made it so dangerous, deadly, in fact, to speak in favor of any kind of shared vision for Jews and Arabs in this land, that even those Arab leaders who were in favor of it couldn't really express that view to the British with this commission. And so, yeah, so we can.
No, so that's I think that's great context for where we are right now. You see all the different forces at play. So I think it's time to get to Hebron and ask the question. Maybe you can walk us through what happened in Hebron in August, yes, 1929.
So in August 1929, Jews gathered at the Kotel on Tisha B'Av, on the 9th of Av, the saddest day on the Jewish calendar, to mourn the destruction of both temples in Jerusalem at the site where that destruction took place. And they gathered in the thousands at the Kotel at the Western Wall. And they had done that every year prior to that for generations. But on this night, unlike other nights, they were surrounded by a line of British police mounted on horses to protect them from the Arabs who had been threatening to attack Jews on Tisha B'Av. And this was just sort of a symbol of what the British had allowed to happen under their watch. I mean, they were not countering the Grand Mufti's incitement and disinformation, even though he was essentially a British official. They had appointed him to his position. And all they were willing to do was just stand there and guard the Jews. They didn't disarm the Arab residents of Jerusalem who had threatened to attack them. No one was hurt that night, but the next day, a few hundred young Jewish activists marched to the Western Wall in a protest against the British. They were carrying flags bearing the Star of David. They were chanting, "The wall is ours." They were singing Hatikva. This is, 2 decades before the state of Israel was born, but they were already singing these songs and carrying these flags. And their march was provocative, but it was absolutely peaceful. No one was hurt. And yet, according to the Grand Mufti and other Arab leaders who he was in charge of, and according to the Arabic press, this march was not peaceful. These young Jews, when they marched the wall, had beaten Muslims at Al-Aqsa. They had raped Muslim women. They had cursed the Prophet Muhammad. None of that was true. But at that point, the truth had become irrelevant because this was after an entire year of disinformation surrounding this Jewish plot to destroy Al-Aqsa. And this march to the wall was exactly the sign that the Grand Mufti needed to prove to his people that it was happening. And so from that day forward, from Tisha B'Av, there were attacks on Jews in Jerusalem. There were counterattacks by Jews against Arabs in Jerusalem. And it all culminated on August 23rd, 1929, at Friday prayers at Al-Aqsa. Thousands of Muslims gathered for Friday prayers there, and they had been told to come armed. They were there carrying sticks, clubs, swords, daggers. And the British, once again, they saw this happening and refused to disarm the worshippers. They were afraid that if they did so, they would have mutiny and there would be riots against the British. So they chose to just allow it to happen. And they just hoped that Friday prayers would go peacefully, and they did not. After prayers in the mosque, when the imam held up a sword, and he said, this land was taken by the sword, it will be saved by the sword. And he called on Muslim worshippers to defend Islam with their blood and defend Al-Aqsa from this Jewish plot to destroy it. And so after Friday prayers on August 23rd, 1929, thousands of armed worshippers flowed down from Al-Aqsa down to the Old City. They attacked Jewish passersby, set fire to Jewish businesses, and those riots that began that day in Jerusalem just ricocheted across Palestine, reaching every Jewish community. So Jews in Gaza were evacuated by the British. Jews in all far-flung places throughout Palestine were evacuated either by the British or the Haganah, brought them to safety in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. But Hebron was really unique because this was it was considered one of the safest places to be a Jew in Palestine. It was a place where Jews and Arabs had coexisted in peace for centuries. They didn't just live side by side, but they owned businesses together. Many of the Jews living in Hebron rented their homes from Arab landlords. They attended each other's weddings and holidays. Many of the Jews in Hebron were Sephardim and Mizrahim who spoke fluent Arabic, and they were friends with their Arab neighbors. They drank coffee together. They played backgammon together. And yet, on August 23rd, 1920, the same day the riots erupted in Jerusalem, that was the same day that the riots came to Hebron. And the Jews in Hebron were completely defenseless. There was no Haganah presence in Hebron. To the contrary, Hebron was actually one of the most anti-Zionist communities in Palestine, which might sound strange to modern ears, but many Jews living in Palestine and throughout the world at that time were anti-Zionist, not for the reasons we know today, but because they were religious Jews who believed that the return of the Jewish masses from exile to the land of Israel should be achieved only through the will of God, the arrival of the Mashiach, that they disagreed with the Zionist movement really because it was just led by secular Europeans. And for Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews living in Palestine, this was a very foreign movement to them. They believed that if we see the redemption of Israel, it should be in a spiritual, religious way, not a secular nationalist, in a nationalist political manner. So one example is when Herzl died, there was an effort to hold a memorial for him in Hebron, and the Jewish community of Hebron was vehemently against that. They said, this is not someone we look up to, have that in Tel Aviv, not here. And it was a very small community. It was just about 800 Jews living surrounded by 20,000 Arabs. And yet, in previous years, when there had been attacks on Jews in other places like in Jaffa or in Jerusalem, those attacks had not reached Hebron. And it was because of those relationships, because the Jews and Arabs in Hebron were friends. And so when the Haganah had come to Hebron in the days before the riots erupted, they had come to warn the Jewish leaders of Hebron that they had word that there were going to be riots, that after Friday prayers, there were going to be attacks on Jews throughout Palestine, and they wanted to either evacuate the entire Jewish community of Hebron to Jerusalem until those riots subsided, because the Haganah was very active in Jerusalem. And they said, we can either evacuate you or we can send some, undercover Haganah members in plain clothes to defend you when those riots arrive. And the Jewish leaders of Hebron were unanimous in their rejection of that offer. They said, those riots will never come here. Our Arab neighbors are our friends. They're never going to let that happen to us. They won't hurt us. And if anyone comes from Jerusalem or elsewhere, they'll protect us. And they believed that because that's what they had been told by their friends. And they were very wrong. The friends,
So
yeah.
what sparked the violence in that case? And was it neighbor on neighbor, or outsiders came rushing into the enclave? Or how did it get started?
So it was a mix of both. Arabs from Jerusalem came to Hebron to tell the Arabs in Hebron that not only that the Jews were trying to destroy Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem, but also that Arabs were being killed in droves and Arab blood was flowing through the streets of Jerusalem. This is what they told them. And so the Arabs of Hebron were told to take vengeance for their brothers in Jerusalem and to defend Al-Aqsa. And many of them had already been told to beware of the Jews in Hebron because they were planning this plot to take over the tomb of the patriarchs and matriarchs. So the ground had already been worked to make people very susceptible to believing these lies that were arriving in August, because they had been fed these lies for a year at that point. And so on August 23rd, there were crowds of men walking through the streets of Hebron, throwing stones at Jewish homes, yelling that they were going to slaughter the Jews. They arrived at the Hebron Yeshiva. And thankfully, there was just one yeshiva student there. He had arrived early with Shabbat. He had come in his Shabbat clothes. He was just praying and didn't hear the mobs outside. And when they arrived at the yeshiva, they killed him. And he was the first victim of the massacre. And there was a British police chief in Hebron who had promised the Jews of Hebron when they came, when they realized that the Haganah was right, that these riots were going to reach them, and they came asking for help. He said, as long as you stay in your homes and you lock your doors and close your windows, you'll be fine. Just don't come out in the streets. And so that's what they did. They stayed in their homes. Some of the Jews who didn't feel safe in their own homes went to the homes of others, like they went to the chief rabbi's homes, the rabbi of the yeshiva. The home of a man named Eliezer Dan Slonim was considered to be the safest home in Hebron because he had many Arab friends. He was the head of the bank in Hebron, and so he had lent money to many Arab businesses. His Arab friends had actually come to his home that morning, the next morning, on Saturday morning, after 70 people had taken shelter in his home. And his friends sat on his doorstep outside and promised that when the rioters arrived, they wouldn't allow them to come in. Early that morning, when the mob did arrive at that home, Eliezer looked outside and his friends were gone. One of them was in the mob was pounding at his door and telling him to open the door. And the leader of the mob told him that as long as he turned over the foreigners among him, so those who had taken shelter in his home, then he and his family would be safe. And Eliezer told them, among us Jews, there are no foreigners. We're all family. And he was the first to be killed. And his wife was raped and murdered. Their 5-year-old son was killed. Their 11-month-old son barely survived. He was found crying next to the body of his mother by one of the many survivors that morning. And you know, the butchering that took place that morning, it only took about 2 hours for them to kill 67 unarmed Jewish men, women, and children. And they did so in the most horrific of ways. They didn't kill them with guns. It was with axes and machetes and daggers. People were burnt to death. Men were castrated. And many of these people were rabbis, yeshiva students. And half of the victims were Jews who had lived in Hebron whose families had been there for generations, for centuries. They were Arabic speakers. These people were not Zionists building the foundations of a Jewish state or threatening to take jobs away from Arabs in Palestine. These were pious Jews living a quiet existence centered around the Torah. They wanted nothing but to live in peace with their neighbors. They were fine with being this tiny minority. And yet that didn't protect them from this disinformation campaign that convinced their neighbors that they were a menacing threat to not only their religion, but to their very existence. And I should say that while 67 people were slaughtered that morning, at least 200 Jews were saved by their Arab neighbors who risked their own lives to hide them inside their homes or stood guard outside of their homes and told the rioters that they would only get into those homes. And to those Jews, they were often their tenants. It was often the landlords renting their homes to Jewish tenants who protected them. And there was one man who was stabbed, a man named Abu Shakar, who was renting a home to the chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Hebron. And that man was actually the father of Eliezer Dan Slonim. So with this one family, the Slonim family, and the people who either killed them or saved their lives, you saw just the spectrum of what humanity is capable of. The heroism that was on display that day was incredible. And the cruelty that was on display that day was just unimaginable.
So let's talk about aftermath. First question is, and this is maybe just like a quick question, is that the end of the Hebron Jewish community until, I can't do the math, but there's going to be a reestablishment of a very tiny community. But are the survivors basically evacuated?
Yeah, they were evacuated by the British just a few days after the riots erupted. The British held them in the police station for 3 days until the riots subsided, not only in Hebron. In Hebron, the British police chief who had told the Jews to stay in their homes, the reason he was able to get those riots to end was because he finally decided to fire his gun. And he only did that hours after the riots had begun and dozens of Jews had been killed. He fired his gun because the rioters turned their swords and axes at him and said, "Let's get the British." And the British had no military in Palestine at the time. They had a British police force. They had, sorry, the Palestine police force, and often the police chiefs were British, but the policemen were usually Arab. So in Hebron, there was a force of about 40 policemen. All but one of them were Arabs. Many of them took part in the massacre or stood guard and allowed them, stood guard outside and allowed the raping and murdering and pillaging inside these homes to take place and then moved on with them. Kafarada, the British police chief, actually ended up shooting an Arab policeman who was in the process of killing a Jewish woman. So the Jews of Hebron were evacuated, and that ended a 3,000-year presence of Jews in Hebron. Sorry, 4,000, nearly 4,000-year presence of Jews in Hebron, because throughout every stage of exile, there had always remained at least some Jews in Hebron, again, because this was and is the second holiest city in Judaism. It was the first capital of the kingdom of Israel when King David established his kingdom. It was actually in Hebron before it was Jerusalem. So Hebron was actually holy to the Jewish people before Jerusalem. And after 1929, it became a city without Jews for the first time.
What are the immediate, we're going to talk, the name of your book is Ghosts of the Holy War, which tells us that this is going to linger in one way or the other. But what are the immediate, over the next decade, let's say, effects of this? What does it do to kind of the politics and the security situation in the region?
The impact was just immense. I really can't overstate what this did to the Zionist movement. So, as I said earlier, Zionism was not this rallying force. It wasn't this unifying movement in Palestine at the time. There were many communities that were opposed to Zionism because it was this secular movement, because it was seen as European. So the Haganah, until 1929, was not a very strong, not a very centralized fighting force, very disorganized, and almost entirely Ashkenazi and secular. That changed after 1929 because the Jews of Palestine realized that the British weren't going to protect them. They needed to protect themselves. So the Haganah became much more organized, better equipped. Many more men joined the Haganah and women. And it transformed the Zionist movement into something that was much more unifying. So, many of these Jews who had until then opposed Zionism for these either religious or political reasons or cultural reasons realized that they couldn't afford to oppose Zionism. If they wanted to live freely and peacefully in the land of Israel, in the Jewish homeland, then the Jews needed their own army. They needed their own state, their own government. They couldn't rely on any foreign powers to protect them. And this is when the Zionist movement became much more of a unifying force within Palestine. And it also led to the Haganah becoming splitting from just the Haganah. This is when you see members of the Haganah say, wait a minute, the Haganah had this policy of restraint. They didn't wage attacks. They didn't preempt attacks. They were all about defending Jewish communities from attacks.
Mm-hmm.
Yet here in the aftermath of 1929, I almost said October 7th, in the aftermath of 1929, members of the Haganah said, wait, we're still going to use this policy of restraint after what just happened? I mean, we knew that these attacks were going to happen. We knew that there were going to be these riots, and it wasn't enough to just warn Jewish communities and defend Jewish communities. We need to be preempting these attacks. And so there was this infighting within the Haganah, and that led to the creation of the Irgun. The Irgun was formed by members of the Haganah who believed that that the Zionist movement needed a militia that was going to prevent attacks. And so it's, the transformation within the Zionist movement itself was tremendous in the aftermath of 1929, but also we saw a transformation within the Arab population of Palestine, because the Grand Mufti became even more powerful and his disinformation campaign went into high gear. And before the massacre, before these riots, there had been other officials and other Arab leaders who were in favor of cooperation and coexistence. And the fact that the British had not only allowed the Grand Mufti to maintain the position they appointed him to, but basically bought his version of the story of what happened in 1929. In the aftermath of the riots, the British had this royal commission come from London to Palestine to investigate the causes of the riots. And over many months, they had hundreds of hours of hearings from British officials, from Jewish victims of the riots, from Jewish officials, Zionist officials, Arab officials, policemen. And I read these testimonies, and it is clear from these hearings that what caused these riots was the incitement and the disinformation campaign. And yet the British, in their conclusion, said that what caused the riots was this demonstration at the Western Wall that played on the fears of Arabs in Palestine, legitimate fears of Jewish immigration and land purchases. And so the British responded by limiting Jewish immigration, limiting Jewish land purchases. Notice I use the word purchases because contrary to the disinformation campaigns of today, none of this land was being stolen, confiscated. It wasn't being given to Jews by the British. It was being purchased at exorbitant prices by Jews from the Arab landowners, many of them absentee landowners who were selling their land to Jews. And then some of these people were leaders of this anti-Zionist movement, telling their people, look, the Jews are stealing our land. This is why we need to fight them. So, that went into high gear as well, because Arab leaders saw that their disinformation and incitement paid off. The British were not going to put an end to that. Instead, they were going to punish the Jews. And what we also saw in the immediate aftermath of the riots was this simultaneous effort to deny that any atrocities had taken place. There was a complete denial by Arab leaders and the Arabic press that Jews had been slaughtered in Hebron. They claimed that not only had Arabs not slaughtered Jews, but any Jews who were killed were actually killed by Jews. One of these claims stated that the Jews who were butchered in Hebron were killed by Hebron yeshiva students who were trying to raise funds from the diaspora for their yeshiva. That was just one of many lies. They also claimed that the riots were instigated by Jews in Jerusalem who attacked Muslim worshippers at Al-Aqsa. That also was not the case. So there's this simultaneous effort to deny the massacre and to blame the massacre on the Jewish victims. And then with the British, they ended up bringing forces from across the British Empire to quell the riots. They brought in British warships, warplanes, troops from throughout the British Empire, because again, there was no military force there. And so within a week, they quelled the riots. They killed over 100 Arabs. But after arresting hundreds of people, they released almost all of them. Just 3 men were sentenced to death. Many others who had been sentenced. Again, this, we talk about the death sentence not today as something that is, inhumane, but at the time it was accepted practice. This was something that the British would do when things like this happened. But in Palestine, under pressure from Arab leaders, they released almost everyone who was arrested, including British policemen who were allowed to continue to serve as policemen. Sorry, not British policemen, Arab policemen who were serving in the British police force. And, the message that this sent to Arab leaders in Palestine, and especially to the Grand Mufti and his followers, was that this pays off. It helps to vilify the Jews of Palestine. The British aren't going to try to figure out who's right and who's wrong. They just want to keep the peace and just want to make sure that these riots don't affect them. And you saw just a repeat of this in 1936 to 1939, when again the British only really responded to this revolt after hundreds of Jews had been killed in the riots that characterized the Great Arab Revolt, but only when a British official was finally killed, then the British finally decided, you know what, we've had enough of this Grand Mufti. We're going to strip him of these positions we appointed him to. He ended up fleeing Palestine, fleeing arrest by the British. First, he ended up in Baghdad. He helped foment the Farhud massacre of Jews in 1941 in Baghdad, and then he again fled arrest by the British. And from 1941 to 1945, he was based in Berlin as the leading voice in the Arab world, spreading Nazi propaganda throughout the Arab world and recruiting thousands of Muslims to fight for the Nazis. He was living in a Nazi-financed estate in Berlin from 1941 to 1945 and was so aligned with the Nazi cause that he was accused of Nazi war crimes. The UN put him on their list of Nazi war criminals in the wake of World War II. He was wanted for Nazi war crimes. Yet once again, he fled. He ended up first in France. The French refused to extradite him to the British, who had still wanted to arrest him. They feared upsetting their the Arab states and Arab kingdoms that were their allies. They feared upsetting their Arab allies. And Arab diplomats eventually helped the Mufti escape from France. He went to Egypt, where he first met his young cousin Yasser Arafat. Arafat became his closest disciple and the heir to his throne as the leader of the Palestinian people. And he eventually moved to Beirut after the Egyptian government kicked him and Arafat out. And the Mufti, unlike many other Nazis, he didn't go into hiding after the war. He lived openly under his name. He died of natural causes in the 1970s. Arafat was at his funeral. And he's still honored by Palestinian leaders as, the founder, a hero of the Palestinian cause. And it's really interesting. And when you search online or ask people who was the first Palestinian leader, they'll often tell you it was Arafat. But the first Palestinian leader, the founder really of the Palestinian national movement, was Grand Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was a unabashed Nazi. I mean, he never expressed any remorse for what he did during the Holocaust. He had also gone rogue during the Holocaust, not only working for the Nazis as their chief Arab propagandist and the leader of the Arab Bureau of the Nazi Ministry of Propaganda, but he also, outside of that, lobbied various European leaders who were not Nazis, urging them to prevent their Jewish refugees from fleeing Europe. And he told them, don't let them come to Palestine, send them to Poland. And this was 1943, 1944. He knew exactly what was happening to Jews in Poland.
So unfortunately, we don't have much time left, but in the short time we do have, I do want to get to some of our viewers' questions that have been coming in on the Q&A. And I'll combine two, because you mentioned you made a Freudian slip and said October 7th before. People are curious about parallels. To the degree that parallels are useful, I mean, it's not the same land. I mean, it's the same land, but it's a different population. But what did October 7th strike you as similar, as different, as avoidable, as unavoidable, based on the research that you had been immersed in?
First, I want to say I started writing this book in 2019. The genesis of this book was a treasure trove of letters discovered in a box in an attic in Memphis by the descendants of a young American who moved to Palestine in 1928 to study at the Hebron Yeshiva. And he was murdered in this massacre in 1929. And over the course of the next 4 years, when I was reading these testimonies and writing this book, I never imagined for a second that anything like what happened to the Jews of Hebron in 1929 could happen again. And on October 7th, I was halfway through my manuscript. I had already written the chapters about 1929. I was in the second half of the book. And, the parallels really speak for themselves. I mean, I'm sure people listening to us talk in the way what I described happening to, the women who were raped, the men who were mutilated, the, women and children who were slaughtered. Um, the fact that it was this peaceful population, that really stood out to me. When in the aftermath of October 7th, seeing how the people who suffered the most on October 7th were, the most peaceful people who had dedicated, many people who had dedicated their lives to helping Palestinians in Gaza, left-wing peace activists. So that's just one parallel. But also the warnings that went ignored. There were many warnings, not just from the Haganah, but also even the Arab friends of Jews in Hebron. They had told them, we're hearing rumors that the Mufti is telling Arabs in Jerusalem and Arabs outside of Jerusalem to arm themselves and rise up against the Jews of Palestine to defend Al-Aqsa. And the Jews in Hebron just kind of, shrugged off, saying, oh, that won't happen. It just sounded too impossible to them. And I think that's, we still don't know because there's sadly no commission of inquiry into the mistakes that led to October 7th. But I think a lot of the warnings that went ignored were similarly, just it people didn't think it could happen. And of course, the parallels to, the disinformation campaigns then versus now. I think many of us consider disinformation a plague of the 21st century of, social media, but disinformation was alive and well in 1929. They didn't need social media. It was in the newspapers. It was in, public squares. It was just imams in mosques, Muslim teachers. Another parallel, I think, is just, this effort to simultaneously deny the atrocities and blame them on their Jewish victims. We saw that play out in the days after October 7th to this day. Plenty of people claim and actually believe that the Israelis who were killed on October 7th were killed by Israel. So, there are so many parallels, and, if you read the book, you'll see it's just chilling how little has changed.
I think another question is about really alternative history. And I know I don't know how useful it is, but was there an alternative? Was there is it, they ask, or not for the Grand Mufti, was there a chance for peaceful coexistence in some form in 1948 after the War of Independence, earlier? And maybe it's a question on both sides. Could either side have done something different so that we're not living with the ghosts of this holy war?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like I could go on for an hour just
No,
with
I
this
know.
one answer, but there were so many points where you could say if they had just done this. So, the British, the High Commissioner, Herbert Samuel, the man who appointed Haj Amin al-Husseini, as opposed to the rivals in that election who had
Mhm.
the Haj Amin al-Husseini had come in last in the election for Grand Mufti in
Mhm.
1921. He did not have to hold that position. The rivals in the election were all less or not at all anti-Semitic. Some of them were cooperative with or willing to cooperate with the Zionist movement. So had one of them been chosen, who knows where we would be today. But later on, I mean, in 1937, when the British proposed either a power sharing agreement or partition, Arab leaders, well, the Grand Mufti, because really there was no other Arab leader who could speak for the Arabs of Palestine. The Grand Mufti was the only one who was speaking for them at the time. Had he accepted one of those options, we could also be in a very different place right now. But even 1947, the UN partition plan, um, before that vote, when the Jews of Palestine and the Jews of the world, the Jewish diaspora and the Zionist movement had made very clear that they were supportive of a two-state solution, and they celebrated the partition plan. And it wasn't just the Grand Mufti this time, but every Arab state, every Arab member of the UN rejected that vote. There were several of them who called for blood to run through the streets of Jerusalem the next day, and that's exactly what happened. This civil war that erupted in 1947, we often talk about the War of 1948, but it actually began in 1947, the day after that UN vote, when Arabs in Palestine began to attack Jews in Palestine in direct response to that vote. And they had been told by their leaders, we need to stand up against we cannot allow the creation of a Jewish state. So there was more, the fervor for preventing the creation of a Jewish state overrode any desire for the creation of the first independent state of Palestine. I mean, there had never been a free Palestine. There had never been an independent state of Palestine, a Palestine ruled by its own people. It had always been ruled by foreign powers, and that could have changed in 1947. But the Arab leaders, not we don't know what the people, the Arabs of Palestine, actually thought, because they weren't, asked their opinion, but their leaders spoke for them and said that they preferred to go to war, prevent the creation of a Jewish state, than to agree to the creation of their own state. There are other points in history, but I think those are the most telling.
Sure. So maybe this has to be, unfortunately, a last question, but I think it's an important one. You were immersed in this for years, and you still are, and I'm sure you're getting a lot of questions as you tour and discuss the book. What about hope? Did you come away from this with any shred of hope? Did you come away despairing that, same as it ever was? How do you leave this project?
So it might surprise you to hear, but I actually came out of this research more hopeful than I had been before, because I saw how clearly the disinformation and the incitement, how obvious that culprit is. Like, if it wasn't for that disinformation, and that incitement by corrupt leaders, the desire by most human beings, including Arabs and Jews and Israelis and Palestinians, is just to live in peace. And that's what I heard from the Arabs I interviewed in Hebron, the Jews I interviewed in Hebron. When I would talk about, Al-Aqsa or the temple, then they would repeat the lies they had been told. But when you ask them about, Jewish neighbors they got along with, there were little signs of, coexistence happening on, a micro level. The sad thing is they didn't want to be named if they were talking about Jewish friends or partnerships with Jewish businesses. They didn't want me to print that. They didn't want me to use their names, or they didn't want me to write about that, because of the fear of being labeled a collaborator. And again, that just points to the contamination of people's minds by corrupt leaders and their disinformation campaigns and their incitement. And yet there were Palestinians I met, and who I've met since the book was published, who are speaking out and are daring to challenge the narrative that Hamas and others want to push, that there can never be, a shared future with Israel, side by side with Palestine, that if there is going to be a state of Palestine, it needs to replace the state of Israel. There are plenty of Palestinians who wish their leaders had agreed to two states for two people. And if they had an environment, if the international community could put their resources, their time, and their funds and their energy into elevating these actually promising Palestinian leaders, those who do favor coexistence, who do favor peace. People like Samir Sinjalawi, who's actually a member of Fatah, but who, is in opposition to Abbas and absolutely is in opposition to Hamas. But many other Palestinians who are risking, everything to speak out in favor of peace. These are the people who the international community needs to get behind. And while that isn't happening now, I'm hopeful that they will in the future, when they realize that those people are the only hope for a better future for Palestinians themselves. I mean, Israel is not going anywhere. The Israelis will be fine. But the Palestinian people are really the ones who've suffered the most from this century of violent opposition to the existence of a Jewish state.
Well, Yardena, thank you so much. The name of the book is Ghosts of a Holy War. And we have links where you can to your website where people can find the book. We look forward to it on the big screen one day. I want to thank Beryl Bessemer and Thea Wieseltier from 70 Faces for helping put this together. And of course, our partners at UJA Federation in New York. Yardena, again, thank you so much for your time and insights. And thank you all for taking part, and we'll see you at the next Folio event.
Thank you all. Thanks, Andy. Take care.